Alyssa Monroe had spent the last 15 years perfecting the art of first-class service. As a senior flight attendant for Skylux Airlines, she was known for her sharp eye, impeccable professionalism, and ability to handle the demands of the airline's elite passengers. She had seen it all: temper tantrums from billionaires, absurd requests for only hand-picked grapes, and the quiet entitlement of those who believed money bought them the right to treat her like a servant. Despite it all, she had maintained her composure, believing herself to be above bias, above judgment. But on this particular evening, as passengers boarded Flight 512 to Paris, something inside her shifted when her gaze landed on a particular family. They stood out, not because they were loud or dressed inappropriately, but because, to Alyssa, something about them didn't seem to fit in first class. The father, a tall, well-groomed man, wore a navy blue suit that, while well-tailored, lacked the ostentation she had come to associate with wealth. The mother, poised and elegant in a modest dress, held the hands of two young children who stood quietly at her side. There was no arrogance in their posture, no desperate attempt to prove they belonged. And yet, as Alyssa scanned their boarding passes, her stomach tightened with an instinct she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way they carried themselves. Or maybe, if she was being honest with herself, it was simply because they weren't what she expected first-class passengers to be. Something about them unsettled her. "Would you mind stepping aside for a moment?" she asked, keeping her tone polite but firm. The father, whose boarding pass read Nathaniel Carter, lifted an eyebrow but said nothing at first. His wife, Vanessa, gave him a quick glance before looking back at Alyssa. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice measured but unmistakably cautious. Alyssa forced a practiced smile, one she reserved for moments when she needed to appear professional while maintaining control of a situation. "I just need to confirm your reservation," she said, though the system had already validated their tickets. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just a fraction. "Of course," he said, his voice as steady as his gaze. He handed over the tickets without hesitation, though there was something in his eyes, an edge, a flicker of recognition that told her he had seen this before. Alyssa turned toward the check-in desk, feigning efficiency as she pretended to review their details. The confirmation came up instantly, just as she knew it would. But still, something in her resisted the urge to accept it at face value. Instead, she stepped toward her supervisor, lowering her voice. "Are we sure about these first-class seats?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "I just want to make sure there were no last-minute upgrades or booking errors." The supervisor gave her a strange look before glancing at the screen. "No mistake," he said, "paid in full. Let them board." Alyssa hesitated. Something about their quiet confidence, their patience, made her uneasy. Still, she nodded and returned to the Carters. But instead of leading them to the spacious, window-lined front of first class, she directed them toward the last row. "Your seats are right this way," she said with an air of finality. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he simply nodded and took his family to their seats. He said nothing. Vanessa followed, her fingers gently resting on her daughter's shoulder. The children didn't complain, didn't even seem to notice the subtle downgrade. If they were upset, they gave no indication. Alyssa felt a strange irritation settle in her chest. She had expected resistance, perhaps even a small protest. But instead, the Carters moved with an unshakable calm that made her feel challenged. Throughout the flight, she kept her eye on them, waiting for something, anything, to validate the nagging doubt in her gut. But nothing came. No entitled requests, no misplaced attitudes, just quiet patience. As she made her rounds, pouring expensive wines and arranging gourmet meals, she found herself actively avoiding their row. When they pressed the service button for water, she let it sit for longer than necessary before sending Melissa, the junior attendant, to handle it. Melissa returned a few minutes later, frowning slightly. "They were just asking for water," she said softly. The little girl was thirsty. Alyssa shrugged, feigning indifference. "I had my hands full." Melissa didn't argue, but something about the way she looked at Alyssa made her stomach twist. Minutes turned into hours, and still, the Carters remained composed. Vanessa helped her son color in a travel activity book while Nathaniel quietly read. The children dozed off eventually, their heads resting against their parents. No complaints, No whispers. No attempts to call attention to the treatment they had received. But their silence spoke louder than words. It was the kind of silence Alyssa recognized too well, the kind that came from people who had endured this before. Who had learned that protesting only made things worse. And somehow, that realization made it worse for her. Near the middle of the flight, as she handed out the first-class meals, she deliberately delayed their row, serving them last. As she finally placed their trays down, her voice was clipped, professional, devoid of warmth. "Apologies for the delay," she said, but the words were empty. Nathaniel met her gaze for a second too long before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you," he said simply. There was no sarcasm in his voice, no accusation, just quiet acknowledgement, as though he understood something she hadn't fully admitted to herself. Alyssa turned quickly and walked away, her hands tightening into fists. But she couldn't shake the feeling that, for the first time in her career, she was not in control of the situation. And the worst part? She didn't know why. Alyssa Monroe moved through the first-class cabin with practiced ease, forcing herself to focus on anything, other than the lingering unease in her gut. The Carters had settled into their seats without protest, their quiet presence gnawing at her, their patience unsettling. She had expected resentment, perhaps a stiff attitude, maybe even a moment of forced small talk to assert their place in first class. But there was nothing. They just sat there, watching, waiting. Alyssa didn't realize she was gripping the service cart too tightly until Melissa, her junior flight attendant, nudged her gently. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft enough to be lost in the low hum of the cabin. Alyssa blinked, releasing the tension in her hands. "Fine," she said too quickly, smoothing her uniform, "just keeping an eye on things." Melissa hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the Carters. Nathaniel was still reading, his fingers calmly turning the pages of his book, while Vanessa traced soothing circles on her sleeping daughter's back. They looked comfortable, like they belonged, but that wasn't how Alyssa saw it. "You're still worried about them?" Melissa whispered, sensing the unspoken concern in Alyssa's face. Alyssa exhaled, feigning indifference. "I've seen it before. People game the system. Sometimes they slip in where they shouldn't." Melissa's brow furrowed, but they had valid tickets. Alyssa shot her a look, her patience thinning. "That doesn't mean they deserve first-class treatment." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and from the sharp intake of breath Melissa took, Alyssa knew she had said too much. Melissa hesitated for a moment longer before murmuring, "I think you're making a mistake." Alyssa turned away, dismissing the gnawing discomfort that clawed at her. She knew how this worked. She had been here long enough to know when someone didn't belong, even if they had a ticket that said otherwise. But what Alyssa didn't realize, what she was blind to in that moment, was that she was being watched. From his seat near the front of first class, a man in a sharp charcoal gray suit sipped his whiskey slowly, his keen eyes tracking every movement Alyssa made. He had noticed everything, the way she avoided the Carters, how their drinks had arrived after everyone else's, the subtle tightening of her lips when she walked past their row. And he wasn't the only one. Several passengers had begun to sense the strange imbalance in the cabin. The way service seemed to shift and warp around one particular family. There was an unspoken tension in the air, an awareness growing like a slow-burning ember threatening to ignite. Alyssa, caught up in her own storm of emotions, had no idea she was teetering on the edge of a precipice. The man in the suit finally set his glass down and gestured for Melissa. She hesitated before approaching, her eyes flicking nervously toward Alyssa. "Yes, sir?" His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it, a deliberate weight behind every syllable. "I couldn't help but notice the delay in service for the family in the last row," he said, his words slicing through the fragile quiet like a knife. "It's rather hard to miss." Melissa swallowed hard. I'm not sure what you mean, sir." The man's expression didn't waver. "A first-class ticket guarantees first-class treatment, does it not?" His gaze flickered toward Alyssa, who had frozen mid-step. A pulse of heat climbed up her spine, her body going rigid as her mind scrambled for a response. "Deny, deflect, dismiss. I assure you, sir, all passengers are receiving equal care," she said, her voice laced with forced politeness. The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "Are they?" he asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, It looks like you're going out of your way to ignore them. Alyssa's stomach tightened, her heart beat a frantic drum against her ribs. I don't think that's a fair assessment, she managed, her smile brittle. The man held her gaze a moment longer before giving a slow, deliberate shake of his head. You might want to reconsider what you think is fair, he murmured, picking up his drink once more. Alyssa's breath came shallow, her throat suddenly dry. The conversation hadn't been loud, but it had been noticed. Other passengers had heard. A few exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. The man hadn't just confronted her, he had exposed her. The control Alyssa had spent the entire flight clutching so tightly was slipping, unraveling thread by thread, and she had no idea how to stop it. But the real blow was yet to come. Unbeknownst to Alyssa, Nathaniel Carter had quietly risen from his seat. He moved with the same steady, deliberate calm he had carried since stepping onto the plane, weaving through the aisles without drawing attention. He didn't approach the galley. He didn't call for Alyssa. Instead, he made his way to the front of the plane, to the cockpit. The co-pilot looked up in mild surprise as Nathaniel arrived at the door, speaking softly to the captain's assistant. Whatever he said was brief, but the shift in the assistant's posture was immediate. A nod, a hurried step inside. Minutes later, a quiet announcement came over the intercom. Miss Monroe, please report to the cockpit immediately. Alyssa felt the words like a punch to the chest. Melissa looked at her with barely concealed worry. What's going on? Alyssa didn't answer. She couldn't. She forced herself to move. Legs stiff, hands clammy. Each step toward the cockpit felt heavier, dragging her toward something she wasn't prepared for. She stepped inside, her breath shallow, her pulse roaring in her ears. The captain, a composed man in his late 50s, looked at her with an expression that sent a cold, slicing fear through her. You wanted to see me, Captain? Alyssa asked, forcing her voice into its usual polished cadence. The captain exhaled slowly, lacing his fingers together on the console. Miss Monroe, he said, his tone measured but unmistakably firm. Do you know who Nathaniel Carter is? Alyssa blinked. He's a first-class passenger, she answered cautiously. The captain's eyes held no mercy. He's more than that. The next words shattered the world Alyssa thought she controlled. Nathaniel and Vanessa Carter are the majority stakeholders in Skylux Airlines. They own this airline. Alyssa's heart stopped. She stared at the captain, her lips parting, but no sound came. No, it wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But the look on the captain's face told her everything she needed to know. They've been conducting an incognito evaluation of our staff, the captain continued. They wanted to see firsthand how our first-class passengers are treated. And I'm afraid, Miss Monroe, that your behavior has been brought to their attention. Alyssa felt her knees go weak. Her fingers trembled. Her vision blurred at the edges as the weight of his words crushed her. She had judged them, dismissed them, treated them as though they didn't belong. And they had watched it all. Alyssa opened her mouth, desperate to explain, to undo the damage, but there was no undoing this. The captain's voice was quiet but absolute. They've requested a meeting with you when we land. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Alyssa felt the walls of the cockpit closing in, her carefully built world crumbling beneath her feet. And for the first time in her 15-year career, she knew she wasn't in control anymore. Not at all. The plane's tires screeched against the tarmac, jolting Alyssa Monroe slightly as Flight 512 completed its landing in Paris. The moment the aircraft slowed, relief washed over her, brief, fleeting, deceptive relief. It was over. The long flight, the unwanted tension, the nagging feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. She could finally step off this plane, forget about the Carters, and move on as she always did. But then, over the intercom, the captain's voice crackled to life. Miss Monroe, please report to the cockpit immediately. Alyssa felt her stomach drop. Melissa, standing just a few feet away, shot her a worried glance. That doesn't sound normal, she murmured. No, it wasn't. Passengers were already standing, stretching, and gathering their belongings. The soft murmurs of quiet conversations filled the cabin. Alyssa forced herself to breathe, to move, to keep her carefully trained expression neutral. With stiff, controlled steps, she made her way down the aisle. As she passed row 1G, Nathaniel Carter's gaze lifted, catching hers. His expression was unreadable, but it was knowing. Her throat tightened as she quickly looked away. The cockpit meeting. The cockpit door shut behind her with a soft but final click. Alyssa had stood in this room countless times before, checking in with the captain, confirming final preparations, reporting minor issues. It was familiar territory. Not today. Captain Harris, a man she had worked with for years, sat in his seat, arms crossed, his gaze heavy with something Alyssa had never seen directed at her before. Disappointment. "Alyssa, take a seat." The first jolt of fear struck her at those words. This was serious. Her legs felt weak as she lowered herself onto the jump seat, forcing her hands to rest calmly in her lap when all she wanted to do was grip something, anything, to keep herself steady. The silence that followed stretched too long. The co-pilot gave her a sideways glance before shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The assistant captain stood nearby, looking tense, as though he wanted to say something but didn't dare speak first. Then, Harris exhaled, shaking his head slightly before speaking. "Alyssa, do you know who Nathaniel and Vanessa Carter are?" The question sent a sharp chill down her spine. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then said what should have been the obvious answer. "They're first-class passengers?" Harris' jaw tightened. "No," he said. "They're the majority stakeholders in Skylux Airlines. They own this airline." Alyssa's breath caught in her throat. No, that wasn't possible. That couldn't be possible. She felt herself go completely still, her brain scrambling to reject what she had just heard. A cold sweat pricked at her skin, but she fought to keep her expression neutral. "Are you sure?" she whispered, the question sounding weak, as if she already knew the answer. Harris let out a slow, controlled breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "They've been conducting an incognito evaluation of our staff, watching how first-class service is handled when no one knows who they are." The weight of his words hit her like a collapsing ceiling. She had denied them proper service. She had questioned their presence. She had deliberately made them wait longer than necessary. She had humiliated herself in front of the people who controlled her entire career. A wave of nausea rose in her stomach, but she forced it down. "Captain, I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem, Alyssa," Harris cut in, his voice sharp but steady. "You didn't know, because you didn't bother to treat them the same as every other first-class passenger. You assumed." She felt something shatter inside her. Because he was right. She could feel every single moment of the flight replaying in her head with brutal clarity. The way she had doubted them from the start. The way she had convinced herself she was protecting the first-class experience. It had all been a lie. A lie she told herself to justify her own prejudice. Harris' voice softened slightly, but it didn't hold reassurance. "They've requested a meeting with you. In the VIP lounge. Before they leave the airport." Alyssa's hands clenched in her lap. A meeting? Her mind spiraled. This wasn't just about the Carters anymore. This was corporate. This was the highest level of authority possible calling her to account. If she went to that meeting, there was no coming back unscathed. But if she refused, she already knew there was no way out. The only choice she had left was how she would face it. The walk of shame. Alyssa's legs felt like lead as she followed Captain Harris through the terminal. The sounds of the bustling airport, the voices, the distant beeps of flight announcements, faded into nothing. Every step toward the VIP lounge felt like a slow march toward execution. It wasn't fair. She had worked for 15 years. She had been loyal. She had given everything to this job. And yet, one mistake, one misjudgment, was enough to unravel everything. Or maybe, it wasn't just one mistake. Maybe it was a lifetime of blindness. All culminating in a moment she couldn't ignore anymore. Harris pushed open the door to the VIP lounge, and Alyssa stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Nathaniel and Vanessa Carter sat in the center of the room. The owners of the airline. The people she had treated as if they didn't belong. Nathaniel sat calmly, his posture composed, his fingers loosely clasped together. Vanessa sat upright, her expression unreadable, her gaze measuring. They weren't angry. They weren't vengeful. They were something far worse. Disappointed. Alyssa felt something deep inside her fracture. "Please, have a seat," Nathaniel said, his voice steady but unyielding. Alyssa lowered herself into the chair, her hands trembling in her lap. Vanessa's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of everything Alyssa had done. "Miss Monroe," she said, "can you explain why you treated us differently on this flight?" Alyssa felt the burn of shame creep up her neck. There was no excuse that could save her. No way to erase the truth of what she had done. For the first time in her entire career, Alyssa felt something she had never truly experienced before. Accountability. Tears burned behind her eyes. But she refused to let them fall. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing but calm. "We're not here to humiliate you," he said. "We're here to understand why someone with your experience would make this choice." Alyssa swallowed hard, the lump in her throat nearly choking her. "Because I assumed you didn't belong." The words ached inside her. And for the first time, she wondered if she could ever make it right. Alyssa Monroe sat frozen in the VIP lounge, her hands locked together in her lap, trying to steady the trembling in her fingers. The air around her felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls of the luxurious lounge had closed in, trapping her in a reality she wasn't prepared for. Across from her, Nathaniel and Vanessa Carter sat in unshakable silence, their expressions unreadable. It was the worst kind of confrontation. No yelling, no outbursts, no anger, just calm disappointment, the kind that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. Alyssa wanted to speak, to defend herself, to find the right words that might somehow undo the damage. But what could she possibly say? That she didn't mean it? That she hadn't intended to treat them differently? That it was just a misunderstanding? She had spent years mastering the art of controlling her image, her presence, the experience of every first-class passenger who stepped onto her flights. But now, she had no control at all. "You know why you're here, Miss Monroe?" Nathaniel finally asked, his voice steady, low, but with a quiet force behind it. Alyssa swallowed hard. She nodded, but her voice betrayed her. I made a mistake." Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. "A mistake?" she echoed, her tone soft but piercing. Alyssa's throat felt like it was closing up. "Yes," she admitted. I didn't treat you the way I should have." Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "And why do you think that is?" Alyssa's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to look away, to escape the weight of his stare, but she forced herself to hold it. The truth burned inside her, clawing at her insides like a monster desperate to be acknowledged. "Because I assumed you didn't belong. Because I looked at you and decided you weren't first-class material. Because, in my mind, I had already judged you." But saying it out loud? It felt like walking to the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall would be devastating. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I let my assumptions influence how I treated you." Vanessa inhaled deeply, sitting back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "And what assumptions were those?" she asked, her tone measured but sharp. Alyssa felt the sting of shame grip her like a vice. She could still lie. She could skirt around it, make it sound less damning, less personal. But what was the point? They already knew. The entire plane had seen it. The passengers had seen it. Melissa had seen it. And worst of all, Alyssa had seen it. She had watched herself make those choices, justifying them in her head, believing she was right, believing she was protecting the prestige of first class. But now, sitting in front of the very people she had dismissed, she felt small. Like a child caught in a lie too big to escape. "I assumed," she admitted, her voice shaking, "that you weren't the kind of people who usually fly first class." Silence. Not a flicker of surprise crossed Nathaniel's face. Not a single reaction from Vanessa. Because, of course, they had heard it before. They had felt this before. But this time, they had the power to call it out. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "And what kind of people are those, Miss Monroe?" Alyssa's breath hitched. Her hands clenched in her lap. The floor beneath her felt unsteady, as if she were about to fall through it. She didn't answer, because saying it out loud felt like condemning herself completely. But the silence itself was an answer. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, exchanging a look with his wife. "Do you know how many times we've been treated this way?" he asked. His voice still calm, but there was an edge to it now. A quiet exhaustion beneath the words. Alyssa shook her head weakly. "You're not the first person to doubt us," he continued, sitting back. "You're not even the 10th. Or the 100th. Vanessa sighed, tapping her manicured nails against the armrest. "Do you know how exhausting it is," she said, "to have to prove ourselves, every time, Because someone like you has already decided we don't belong? Alyssa felt her chest tighten. She wanted to disappear. Vanessa's voice softened, but it wasn't kindness, it was truth. You've worked for this airline for 15 years. She said. Tell me, what have you learned? The question knocked the air out of her. 15 years. 15 years of training. 15 years of experience. And yet, here she was, being asked the most basic question. And she had no answer. A lump formed in her throat. Alyssa had spent so much time believing she was professional. Believing she knew better. But now? Now, she felt like she had learned nothing at all. Nathaniel's voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. What happens next, he said, is out of our hands. Alyssa's breath caught. Vanessa's gaze was steady. Corporate will handle it from here. A fresh wave of panic crashed over Alyssa. This wasn't just a talking to. This wasn't something she could brush off. This was real. Her job, her career, everything she had built for 15 years, was now in free fall. Please, Alyssa whispered, her voice barely audible. I can fix this. Nathaniel studied her, his expression unreadable. Can you? Alyssa's hands shook. I didn't mean. But you did. Vanessa interrupted gently. Alyssa's words died in her throat. Because they were right. She had meant it, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. And that was the hardest truth of all. Alyssa Monroe, the flight attendant who had prided herself on professionalism, had been blind to her own bias. Until now, the walls of the lounge seemed to close in, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Then, Nathaniel stood. The meeting was over. Vanessa followed, adjusting her coat with an effortless grace. Alyssa remained seated, frozen in place. We've said what we needed to. Vanessa said simply. What happens next? That's up to Skylux. Alyssa opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Nathaniel turned to her one last time. His expression wasn't cruel, nor was it angry. It was final. I hope you think about this, he said. Really think about it. And with that, they walked out of the lounge, leaving Alyssa alone with the wreckage of what she had done. The door clicked shut behind them. And for the first time in 15 years, Alyssa Monroe realized she might have just lost everything. The door to the VIP lounge clicked shut behind Nathaniel and Vanessa Carter, leaving Alyssa Monroe sitting motionless, her hands still clenched in her lap. The echoes of their voices, calm yet devastating, lingered in the air around her. Think about this. Really think about it. Alyssa couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even process what had just happened. Her entire world, the career she had devoted 15 years to, the reputation she had so carefully built, was crumbling around her. A part of her wanted to believe it wasn't real. That somehow, when she walked out of this room, she would step back into the life she knew, the life where she was in control, where her decisions were right because she had always believed them to be. But deep down, in the pit of her stomach, she knew, this wasn't something she could smooth over. This wasn't something she could undo. And the worst part? For the first time in her life, she didn't know if she deserved to. The days of waiting. Alyssa barely remembered leaving the airport that night. Her legs had carried her through the terminal on autopilot, past passengers who had no idea that the woman walking beside them had just seen her entire future slip through her fingers. She had gotten into a taxi, given her address in a hollow voice, and sat in silence as the lights of Paris blurred past her. By the time she reached her apartment, she felt numb. She stood in her living room, staring at nothing, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. She wanted to cry, to scream, to do something, but she just couldn't. Instead, she sat on her couch, her uniform still perfectly pressed, and waited. For what? She didn't even know. The first day passed in a fog. She checked her email 100 times, her heart seizing every time the screen refreshed. But there was nothing from Skylux. She forced herself to eat, though food tasted like ash in her mouth. The second day, she turned off her phone. She couldn't bear to look at it anymore, to see if Melissa had texted, if anyone from work had reached out, if her name had started spreading in the way she feared it would. The silence in her apartment was suffocating. She had built her entire life around this job, poured everything into being the best flight attendant in first class. But now, she had nothing to hold on to. She had convinced herself that she was better than most, that she had earned her place in Skylux because of her professionalism, her experience, her ability to maintain control. But what was it all worth if she had been blind to something so simple? She had failed. And not just in her career. She had failed as a person. Hearing the truth from strangers. On the third day, Alyssa couldn't take the silence anymore. She left her apartment, wandering the streets of Paris aimlessly. The city, usually so full of life and beauty, felt distant. She ended up in a quiet coffee shop, hoping that the low hum of conversation would distract her from the storm in her head. She ordered coffee but barely touched it. Then, she heard something that made her blood freeze. A few tables over, two women were talking in hushed voices. "Did you hear about the Skylux incident?" one of them asked. Leaning forward slightly, Alyssa's stomach dropped. The second woman nodded, stirring her drink absently. "Yeah, the owners were on a flight, and the crew treated them like second-class citizens. Can you believe that?" Alyssa felt her heart start to race. The first woman scoffed. "It's all over the internet. Some people are saying the flight attendant should be fired." The words hit Alyssa like a knife. Fired. She gripped the edge of her table, trying to steady herself. "Honestly," the second woman continued, "if you can't treat people with basic respect, you shouldn't be working in first class. It's that simple." Alyssa stopped breathing. Her worst fear was happening. People knew. She felt a sudden urge to run, to leave the coffee shop, to escape the reality crashing down on her. But she didn't move, because this was the moment she realized the truth. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. The email that changed everything. The next morning, Alyssa woke to the sound of her phone buzzing. Her hands were clammy as she picked it up, her breath catching when she saw the email notification. Subject: Decision regarding suspension, Alyssa Monroe. Her body felt ice cold as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the words rapidly, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then, she stopped. One sentence stood out, bold and final. "Your employment with Skylux Airlines will be terminated effective immediately." Alyssa stared at the screen. The words didn't change. No matter how many times she read them, they were still there. Terminated. It was over. Her job, her career, everything. Her breath shook as she set the phone down. She felt like she was floating, like she had detached from her own body. This moment, the moment she had been dreading, had finally arrived. And yet, she didn't feel anger. She didn't feel shock. She felt empty, because she knew she had done this to herself. She had been given a position of trust, a position where she had the responsibility to treat people with dignity. And she had failed. A turning point. For hours, Alyssa sat in her apartment, staring at the email. She thought about the Carters, the way they had remained calm, even in the face of disrespect. She thought about Melissa, the way she had tried to warn her. She thought about the two women in the coffee shop, their words ringing in her head. She thought about her 15 years at Skylux. And she thought about who she had been all this time. Then, for the first time since that flight, Alyssa cried, not because she had lost her job, but because she finally understood why she had lost it. She had spent her life believing that her way was the right way, that experience meant superiority. That first class belonged to a certain type of person. But what had that belief done for her? It had blinded her. And now, she had to live with the consequences. As the tears slowed, Alyssa inhaled shakily, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. This wasn't the end, but if she ever wanted to rebuild her life, she had to start over. She had to change. She had to learn. And this time, she had to do it the right way. A message to you. If you made it this far, I want to hear from you. What would you say to Alyssa? Do you believe people can change? Can one mistake define a person forever? Or does everyone deserve a chance to do better? Drop a comment below. Let's talk. And if this story resonated with you, hit that like button and share it. Because the truth is, we all have moments where we need to change. The question is, do we have the courage to? Alyssa Monroe had spent days drowning in the silence of her own downfall. The walls of her apartment felt smaller, the air heavier, suffocating her under the weight of her own regret. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Carters, calm, dignified, yet disappointed, sitting across from her in the VIP lounge, watching as her carefully constructed world crumbled around her. She had spent 15 years believing she knew what professionalism meant, that her instincts, her judgments, were sharp enough to separate the people who belonged in first class from those who didn't. And in that belief, she had let her bias slip through like a whisper, subtle yet devastating. Now, she had been forced to see herself through someone else's eyes, and what she saw made her sick. She had become someone she never thought she was. And now, without her job, her title, her sense of control, she was left alone with a single, inescapable question. What happens next? The loneliness of consequences. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the email came, the one that had sealed her fate. Her phone had buzzed dozens of times at first, but she couldn't bring herself to check the messages. She didn't want to see her coworkers reaching out with pity in their words. Or worse, silence, afraid to be associated with her now that she had become a cautionary tale. So she ignored them. She stayed curled up in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like she was drowning in her own skin. For so long, Alyssa had defined herself by her job, her position in the airline industry. Without it, she wasn't sure who she even was anymore. And maybe that was the most terrifying part. She had always prided herself on being in control, on knowing how to manage any situation. But this was the first time in her life that she had no idea what to do. And so she did nothing. Until the knock on her door broke through the quiet. A lifeline in the darkness. Alyssa hesitated before opening it, half hoping it would be no one at all. That maybe it was just a package being delivered, something she could ignore. Something she didn't have to face. But when she finally pulled the door open, she saw Melissa. Melissa, the one person on that flight who had seen everything. The one who had tried to warn her. The one she had dismissed. Alyssa's chest tightened, and for a brief moment, she considered closing the door. But Melissa's gaze was gentle, concerned, and before Alyssa could even think to push her away, she said, "I just wanted to check on you." Alyssa opened her mouth to speak, to say what exactly. She wasn't sure. That she was fine? That she didn't need pity? That she deserved every bit of what had happened? But no words came out. Instead, her throat tightened, and before she could stop herself, she let out a shaky breath, one that cracked at the edges, revealing just how broken she really was. Melissa didn't push. She just stood there, waiting, giving Alyssa the space to decide if she wanted to let someone in. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Alyssa stepped aside and let the door open fully. The conversation that changed everything. They sat in silence at first, Melissa sipping the coffee she had brought while Alyssa stared at the untouched cup in front of her. Then, after a long pause, Melissa finally spoke. "I know this feels like the end," she said gently, "but it doesn't have to be." Alyssa let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Doesn't it? I lost my job, my reputation, my career is over." Melissa tilted her head slightly, studying her. "You lost your job, yes, but what if your career, your real career, hasn't even started yet?" Alyssa frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Melissa exhaled, choosing her next words carefully. "For years, you've built your identity around being a flight attendant. And not just any flight attendant, a first-class flight attendant. Someone who knows the rules. The unspoken hierarchy. The way things are supposed to be." Alyssa's jaw tightened, her instinct to defend herself rising. But she didn't speak, because Melissa was right. She had spent years believing she was one of the best, because she had trained herself to be. She had mastered the art of catering to the elite, to those who expected perfection. And in doing so, she had lost sight of what her job was really supposed to be about. Melissa's voice softened. "Maybe this isn't the end of your career, Alyssa. Maybe it's the beginning of something better. But that depends on whether or not you're willing to change." Alyssa's hands tightened around her coffee cup, her fingers going white. Change. She had spent so long believing she didn't need to. That her experience made her immune to mistakes. That her judgment was always right. But wasn't that what had gotten her here in the first place? She took a shaky breath. "How?" she asked, her voice small. "How do I change?" Melissa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe you should talk to your sister." A bridge to the past. Alyssa flinched. Leah, the sister she hadn't spoken to in over a year. The sister who had spent her entire career working in diversity and inclusion, helping people see their own biases and guiding businesses to create fairer workplaces. Alyssa had never taken her seriously. She had always thought Leah was too sensitive, too quick to call out things Alyssa had believed were just part of how the world worked. And now? Now Alyssa was sitting in the wreckage of her own ignorance. And she had never needed Leah more. But would she even want to hear from her? Would she even pick up the phone? Melissa must have seen the hesitation in her face because she simply said, "If you're serious about changing, she's the person who can help you." Alyssa stared at her phone for hours before she finally dialed Leah's number. Her hands were shaking as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. And then, "Hello?" Her voice was the same. Warm, but cautious. Alyssa took a deep breath. And then, for the first time, she let her guard fall completely. She told Leah everything. She told her about the Carters. About her choices. About how she had seen herself through someone else's eyes for the first time. And when she finished, Leah was silent for a long time. Then, finally, she said, "Alyssa, this is the conversation I never thought you'd be willing to have." Alyssa closed her eyes, her chest tightening. "I know." Leah sighed. "Change isn't about saying the right words. It's about doing the hard work. Are you ready for that?" Alyssa swallowed hard. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I want to be." A pause. Then Leah said, "That's a start." And for the first time in a long time, Alyssa felt something she hadn't felt since that flight. Hope. What do you think? Alyssa is finally realizing the truth about herself. But can she really change? Can she rebuild after losing everything? Let's talk about it in the comments. Do you think people can truly grow after making mistakes? Hit like if you believe in second chances. And comment to encourage Alyssa on her journey. Because change is hard, but sometimes, it's the only way forward. For weeks, Alyssa Monroe woke up with the same heavy feeling in her chest. Every morning, she opened her eyes to a silence so thick it felt like it would swallow her whole. No more early alarms. No more crisp uniforms hanging neatly in her closet. No more first-class cabins filled with the clinking of champagne glasses and whispered conversations between the elite. No more of the job she had poured 15 years of her life into. Instead, she woke up to the reality of who she had been, and the regret that came with it. The first few days after her termination had been a blur of isolation, not because no one reached out, but because Alyssa couldn't bring herself to face them. She ignored Melissa's texts, let calls from former coworkers go straight to voicemail, and barely ate anything that wasn't instant or delivered. She told herself she was just taking time, but deep down, she knew the truth. She was hiding. And maybe, she deserved to. But hiding wasn't the same as growing. Alyssa had spent years believing she was a person who knew things, who understood how the world worked, how people operated, how the airline industry functioned. She had never thought of herself as biased. But when she replayed that flight in her mind, she saw everything differently now. She saw herself deliberately ignoring the Carters. She saw the way she had justified treating them differently. She saw how unbothered they had been by it, not because it didn't hurt, but because they had been through it before. And when she thought about that, about how many times they must have sat in first class waiting for someone to question whether they belonged, her stomach twisted with something deeper than regret. Shame. Because how many other people had she treated that way? How many times had she made someone feel less than without even realizing it? The questions haunted her, but what was she going to do about it? One afternoon, a week after her call with Leah, she finally answered one of Melissa's texts. "Melissa, I hope you're okay. No pressure, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here." Alyssa hesitated for only a second before typing. "Alyssa, I don't know if I deserve to talk to you after how I treated you on that flight." Melissa's reply came almost instantly. "Melissa, I'm not here to punish you. Alyssa, I just want to know if you're trying to be better." Alyssa felt her throat tighten. She stared at the message for a long time before finally typing. "Alyssa, I want to. I just don't know how." "Melissa, then let's start there." And so, she did. At first, it was small, a conversation here, an article there, but the more she read, the more she realized just how blind she had been. There were entire books, studies, and first-hand accounts from people who had spent their entire lives navigating the bias she had ignored. She read about unconscious bias, about how easy it was for people to assume they were fair and objective while their actions told a different story. She read about microaggressions, those subtle, seemingly small actions that built up over time and told someone, "You don't belong here." She read about privilege, a word she had spent years dismissing, believing it had nothing to do with her. But now, as she looked back at the hundreds of tiny decisions she had made as a flight attendant, she saw it clearly. The way she had never second-guessed a wealthy, older white man when he presented a first-class ticket. The way she had never felt the instinct to double-check the reservation of a young blonde woman in designer clothes. But the Carters? Her gut had told her something was off. And that was the problem. It was always off for people like them. That realization broke something open inside her. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about years of conditioning. And if she had spent 15 years learning the wrong things, then she needed to start learning the right ones. Leah was hesitant at first when Alyssa told her she wanted to understand more. "I don't want to help you if this is about clearing your conscience," she had said, her voice even. "I'll help you if it's about changing who you are." And for the first time, Alyssa didn't get defensive. She just said, "That's what I want." Leah told her about a nonprofit that worked with businesses to identify bias in the workplace and help people unlearn it. Alyssa wasn't sure at first if she even had a place in that kind of work, wasn't sure if she should even be allowed to help after what she had done. But when she met the team at the organization, she was surprised. No one there treated her like a villain. Instead, they treated her like something far more painful, a person who needed to learn. "You're not the first person who's had to face their biases," one of the program directors told her after their first conversation. "The question is, are you willing to sit with the discomfort and actually change? Or are you just looking for a way to make yourself feel better?" Alyssa took a shaky breath. "I want to change," she said. And for the first time in a long time, she meant it. She started small, attending workshops, listening to people who had lived through the kind of bias she had never seen before. And the more she listened, the smaller she felt, not because she was being torn down, but because she was finally understanding just how much she had overlooked. But something else happened, too. She started feeling lighter. Not because she had redeemed herself, that wasn't the point. But because for the first time, she was no longer hiding from the truth. She was finally facing it. And the more she faced it, the more she realized something incredible. She wasn't alone. There were so many people like her, people who had spent their lives unaware of the way their actions affected others. People who had been called out, who had faced consequences, and had decided to do better. People who, like her, had finally woken up. One day, months later, Alyssa wrote a letter to Nathaniel and Vanessa Carter. She didn't expect them to read it. She didn't expect them to forgive her. That wasn't why she wrote it. She wrote it because she needed to say the words she should have said that night in the VIP lounge. She thanked them for holding her accountable, for not letting her ignore what she had done, for forcing her to see herself in a way she never had before. She told them that their flight had changed her life. And she told them that she wasn't looking for redemption. She was looking to be better. As she sealed the envelope, Alyssa took a deep breath. She didn't know if they would ever read it. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't running from herself anymore. She was choosing to change. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Alyssa Monroe never thought she would find herself standing in front of hundreds of people, telling the story that had once been her greatest shame. She had spent years running from it. The flight, the Carters, the look in Vanessa Carter's eyes that night in the VIP lounge, the silent yet undeniable disappointment that had cut deeper than she ever thought possible. It had taken everything from her. Or at least, that's what she had believed. Now, as she adjusted the microphone in front of her, looking out at a room filled with business executives, HR professionals, and employees from every walk of life, she realized something she never could have understood back then. That flight hadn't taken everything. It had given her something she never knew she needed. A chance to be better. She took a deep breath and began the journey to redemption. It had been almost 5 years since Alyssa had lost her job. 5 years since she had been forced to confront the reality of who she had been. At first, she thought she would never recover. That her career was over. That no one would ever take her seriously again. But as time passed, she realized that losing her job wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far greater. She had spent the first few months drowning in guilt and regret, feeling like the weight of her mistake would crush her. But guilt alone wasn't enough. Feeling bad wasn't enough. She had to do the work. So, she did. She immersed herself in understanding bias, really understanding it, not just in the shallow way she had before. She learned about the small, daily choices that people made, the unconscious assumptions that shaped their actions. She had spent years thinking she wasn't part of the problem. But now, She saw it differently. Bias wasn't always obvious. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was in the way a flight attendant glanced at a boarding pass and hesitated. In the way one row in first class was served just a little slower than the others. In the way someone like her, who had spent 15 years in the airline industry, had never questioned why she instinctively trusted some passengers more than others. She had been blind to it. But now, she saw it everywhere. And that realization changed her forever. From mistake to mission, Alyssa didn't just learn for herself. She started sharing what she learned. At first, it was small, conversations with people in the airline industry, discussions in online forums, volunteering at organizations that focused on workplace inclusivity. Then, one day, she got an email. It was from a former coworker, someone who had been on that flight, someone who had seen what had happened. And they had a question for her. Would you be willing to come speak to our team about what you've learned? Alyssa had stared at the email for hours before responding. Did she deserve to speak about this? Would people even listen? But then, she thought about something Leah had told her. Real change isn't about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them, owning them, and using them to help others see things differently. So, she said yes. And that one yes turned into something bigger than she ever imagined. Before long, she was being invited to companies, leadership summits, and training workshops, sharing her story not as a success, but as a warning. She told them what it was like to be blinded by bias. She told them how easy it was to believe you were just following procedure, while actually upholding discrimination. She told them what it felt like to lose everything because she had refused to see what was right in front of her. And people listened, because she wasn't preaching, she wasn't lecturing. She was living proof that bias wasn't just a problem for other people. It was a problem for all of us. A letter she never expected to send. One evening, long after she had finished giving a seminar, Alyssa sat at her desk with a pen in her hand and a blank sheet of paper in front of her. She had been thinking about it for weeks. And finally, she knew she had to do it. She wrote to the Carters. She had no idea if they would ever see it, if they had moved on, if they even remembered her. But she had to say it anyway. She told them that what had happened on that flight had changed her life. Not because she had been punished. Not because she had been humiliated. But because they had made her face the truth. She thanked them, not just for holding her accountable, but for showing her, with their grace, with their patience, with their quiet dignity, who she had been. She told them that she had dedicated her life to learning, growing, and teaching others. And she told them that she would never forget what they had taught her. When she mailed the letter, she didn't expect a response. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she was finally at peace with what she had done, because she had chosen to be better. What this story can teach us all. As Alyssa stood at the podium, finishing her speech, she looked out at the crowd. There were tears in some people's eyes. Others sat silent, thinking. And that's when she knew. This story, her story, wasn't just about one flight attendant making a mistake. It was about all of us. Because we have all, at some point, made assumptions we weren't even aware of. We have all judged someone without realizing it. We have all had moments where we acted in a way that, later, we wished we could take back. But the real question isn't whether we've made mistakes. The real question is, what do we do once we recognize them? Do we pretend they never happened? Do we get defensive, refuse to change, tell ourselves we had good reasons? Or do we do the hard thing? Do we own it? Do we learn? Do we choose to be better? That's the lesson Alyssa hoped everyone in that room would walk away with. That's the lesson she hoped you would walk away with. Because change is possible. And it starts with you. What would you do? Let's talk about it. What do you think about Alyssa's journey? Do you believe people can truly change? Or do you think some mistakes are too big to come back from? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of growth and redemption, hit like to support this story. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, because these conversations matter. And remember, we are all capable of change. The question is, will you choose to?